Our principles of right and wrong form a framework of the way we live our lives. But where do these principles come from? Let's take a look at ethical systems. Ethical systems provide the answer to the question of why something is right or wrong. To be accepted as an ethical system, the systems of principle must be intentionally consistent, must be consistent with generally held beliefs, and must possess a type of moral common sense. We can further describe ethical systems as having the following characteristics. They are prescriptive. Certain behavior is demanded or prescribed. They're not just abstract principles of good and bad, but have substantial impact on what we do. They're authoritative. They're not ordinarily subject to debate. Once an ethical framework has been developed, it's usually beyond question. They are logically impartial or universal. Moral considerations arising from ethical systems are not relative. The same rule applies in all cases for everyone. They are not self-serving. They're directed towards others. What is good for everyone, not just for the individual. We don't consistently think of ethical systems, but we use them to make moral judgments. Moral rules in this case might be as follows. Children should be looked after. One shouldn't drink to excess. Mothers should be a good role model for their children. In this figure of the ethical pyramid, the moral judgment discussed above is at the top of the pyramid, supported by moral rules, on which judgment is based. The moral rules, in turn, rest upon a base, which is one's ethical system. An ethical system is a structured set of principles that defines what is moral. The ethics of virtue is the ethical system that bases ethics largely upon character and possession of virtues. Aristotle believed that to be good, one must do good. Virtues that a good person possesses include thriftiness, temperance, humility, industrialness, and honesty. Aristotle also believed that happiness was the goal of life. Aristotle defined virtues as excellences. He distinguished intellectual virtues like wisdom and understanding from moral virtues like generosity and self-control. To possess the moral virtues is not sufficient for the good life. One must also have the intellectual virtues, primarily practical reason. Aristotle believed that we are, by nature, neither good nor evil, but become so through training and acquisition of habits. Habits of a moral virtue are developed by following the example of a moral exemplar, that is, a parent or virtuous role model. These habits are also more easily instilled when the right or just laws also exist. Moral virtue is a state of character in which choices are consistent with the principle of the golden mean. This principle states that virtue is always the median between two extremes of character. For instance, proper pride is the balance between empty vanity and undue humility. Courage is the balance between cowardness and foolhardiness, and so on. Moral virtue comes from habit, which is why this system emphasizes character. The idea is that one does not do good because of reason, rather, one does good because of the patterns of a lifetime. Those with good character will do the right thing, and those with bad character usually will choose the immoral path. Somewhat related to the ethics of virtue's ethical system are the 6 pillars of character. The 6 pillars of character echo Aristotle's virtues. They include the following. Trustworthiness. This concept encompasses honesty and meeting one's obligations. Honesty means being truthful, forthright, and sincere, and the pillar also involves loyalty, living up to one's beliefs, and having values. Respect. This pillar is like the second portion of the categorical imperative of ethical formalism, which will be discussed subsequently. The concept admonishes us to treat each person with respect and not as a means to an end. The idea is also like the golden rule in Christianity. Responsibility. This means standing up for one's choices and being accountable. Everyone has a moral duty to pursue excellence, but if one fails, the duty is to take the responsibility for the failure. Fairness. This concept involves treating people equally, impartially, and due process. To treat everyone fairly doesn't necessarily mean to treat them the same, but rather apply fairness in terms of one's dealings with everyone. Caring. This pillar encompasses the ideas of altruism and benevolence. Citizenship. This includes the duties of every citizen, including voting, obeying the law, being a good steward of natural resources of one's country, and doing one's fair share. One difficulty with the ethics of virtue is in judging the primacy of moral virtues. The natural law ethical system holds that there is a universal set of rights and wrongs that are like many religious beliefs, but without reference to a specific supernatural figure. Morality is part of the natural order of the universe. Further, this morality is the same across cultures and times. The natural law ethical system presupposes that what is good is what is natural, and what is natural is what is good. The essence of morality is what conforms to the natural world. Thus, there are basic inclinations that form the core of moral principles. Natural law theory defines good as what is natural. The difficulty of this system is identifying what is consistent and congruent with the natural inclinations of humankind. How do we know which acts are in accordance with the natural order of things? Who determines what are natural laws? Natural law has been employed to restrict the rights and liberties of groups of people. Honesty and fair dealings are always prioritized over other values. A deontological system is one that's concerned solely with the inherent nature of the act being judged. If an act or intent is inherently good, coming from a good will, it is still considered to be good even if it results in adverse consequences. The philosopher Immanuel Kant wrote that the only thing that was intrinsically good is goodwill. On the other hand, if someone does an action from a good will, it can be considered a moral action even if the results have adverse consequences. However, if someone performs some activity that looks on the surface to be altruistic, but does it with an ulterior motive, for instance, to curry favor or gain benefit, the act is not judged as good just because the results are good consequences. Only if the act springs from a good will can we say that it's truly good. Kant distinguished hypothetical versus categorical imperatives. Hypothetical imperatives are commands that designate certain actions to attain certain ends. An example is, if I want to be a success, then I must do well in college, or if I want people to like me, then I must be friendly. By contrast, a categorical imperative commands action that is necessary without any reference to the intended purposes or consequences. The imperative of morality needs no further justification. The following constitutes the principles of Kant's categorical imperative of morality. Act only on that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it should be a universal law. In other words, for any decision of behavior to be made, examine whether that behavior would be acceptable if there were a universal law to be followed by everybody. Act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or that of any other, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an ends. In other words, one should not use people for one's own purposes. Act as if you were, through your maxims, a law-making member of the kingdom of ends. This principle directs the individual's actions to contribute to an end consistent with universal law. However, the good act must be done freely. A system such as ethical formalism is an absolutist system. If something is wrong, it is wrong all the time, such as murder or lying. The absolute judgment is criticized by those who argue that there are sometimes exceptions to any moral rule, such as one should not lie. In a well-known hypothetical, Kant argued that if someone asked to be hidden from an attacker in close pursuit, and then the attacker asked where the potential victim was hiding, it would be immoral to lie about the victim's location. This just seems wrong to many of us. However, Kant argued that an individual cannot control consequences, only actions. Therefore, one must act in a moral fashion without regard to the potential consequences. Kant also defended his position with semantics, distinguishing untruths from lies with the explanation that a lie is only a lie when the recipient is led to believe or has the right to believe that he or she is being told the truth. This ethical framework follows simply from the benefits of an individual must follow a self-imposed moral law, and that one can use reason to determine right actions because any action can be evaluated by using the principles just listed. The core elements of the duty-based ethical system are the importance of intention and the use of a predetermined set of principles to judge morality. A teleological ethical system judges the consequences of an act. Even a bad act, if it results in good consequences, can be defined as a good under a teleological system. The saying that ends justifies the means is a teleological statement. The utilitarian doctrine asserts that we should always act to produce the greatest possible ratio of good to evil for everyone concerned. That is, if one can show that an action significantly contributes to the general good, then it is good. In situations where we must decide between a good for an individual and a good for society, the society should prevail, despite the wrong being done to the individual. This is because utility or good derived from an action generally outweighs the small amount of harm done to the individual, because the harm is done to only one, whereas the good is multiplied to many. Although utilitarianism is quite prevalent in ethical reasoning, there are some serious criticisms of it. All pleasures or benefits are not equal. The system also presumes that one can predict the consequences of one's actions. There is little concern for individual rights under utilitarianism. Utilitarianism has two forms: act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. Let's take a look. The basic difference between the two can be summarized as follows. In act utilitarianism, only the basic unity derived from one action is examined. We look at the consequences of any action for all involved and weigh the units as utility accordingly. In rule utilitarianism, one judges the action by the precedent it sets and the long-term utility of the rule set by the action. In both approaches, one must judge as good only those actions that can be universalized. In summary, utilitarianism holds that the morality must be determined by the consequences of an action. The difference between ethical formalism and rule utilitarianism is that actions themselves are judged right or wrong depending on the motives behind them under ethical formalism, whereas utilitarianism looks at the long-term consequences of the prescribed rules to determine their morality. Ethics of care is an ethical system that defines good as meeting the needs of others and preserving and enriching relationships. The ethics of care has been described as a feminine morality because women in all societies are child-bearers and consequently seem to have a greater sensitivity to issues of care. The ethics of care is founded in the natural human response to care for a newborn child, the ill and the hurt. There are similarities in the ethics of care idea, and morals derive from natural human impulses of compassion. What I feel is right, and what I feel is wrong is wrong. Applying the ethics of care does not necessarily lead to different solutions, but perhaps to different questions. In an ethical system based on care, we would be concerned with issues of needs rather than rights. Certainly, the restorative justice movement is consistent with the ethics of care because of its emphasis on the motives and needs of all concerned rather than simply retribution. In personal relationships, the ethics of care would promote empathy and treating others in a way that does not hurt them. In this view, meeting the needs is more important than securing rights. Peacemaking justice is an ancient approach to justice that includes the concepts of compassion and care, connectedness and mindfulness. The concept is derived from an ancient principle, and it concerns care as well as other concepts. Peacemaking, as evolved from ancient spiritual and wisdom traditions, has included the possibility of mercy and compassion within the framework of justice. The peacemaking process is comprised of three parts: connectedness, caring, and mindfulness. Connectedness refers to the relationships we all have with one another and all of us have with the earth. Caring refers to the concept that the natural inclination of humans is to care for one another. Mindfulness involves being aware of others and the world in all personal decision-making. To summarize, the ethics of care approach identifies the needs of all individuals in any ethical situation and attempts to maximize them. It is different from utilitarianism, however, in that one person cannot be sacrificed for others. Also, there is an attempt to resolve situations through human relationships and a sense that decisions should come from compassion rather than an attention to rights or duties. Egoism is the ethical system that defines the pursuit of self-interest as a moral good. The extreme of this position is that all people should operate on the assumption that they can do whatever benefits themselves. Others become solely the means to ensure happiness, and there's no recognition of the rights of others under this system. Psychological egoism refers to the belief that humans are naturally egoists and that it would be unnatural for them to be any other way. All species have instincts for survival, and self-preservation and self-interest are merely part of that instinct. Therefore, it's not only moral to be egotistic, but it's also the only way we can be, and other explanations of behavior are mere rationalizations. Enlightened egoism is a slight revision of this basic principle, adding that each person's objective is long-term welfare. This may mean that we should treat others as we'd want them to treat us to ensure cooperative relations. Most philosophers reject egoism because it violates the basic tenets of an ethical system. Universalism is inconsistent with egoism because to approve of all people acting in their own self-interest is not a logical or feasible position. Egoism supports exploiting others by the strong against the weak, which seems wrong under ethical systems. One thing is clear, when individuals are caught doing illegal acts, it's usually only egoism that can justify their behavior. The imperative principle directs a decision maker to act according to a specific, unbending rule. The first principle is to examine one's obligations and duties and what one has promised to do by contract or by taking on a role. This is like ethical formalism's focus on duty. The utilitarian principle determines the ethics of conduct by the good or bad consequences of the action. The second principle is to examine moral ideals, such as how one's decision squares with the prudence, temperance, justice, honesty, compassion, and other ideals. This is like Aristotle's ethics of virtue. The generalization principle is based on this question: what would happen if all similar persons acted in this way under similar circumstances? The third principle is to evaluate and act to determine if it would result in good consequences. This is utilitarianism. Questions more specific to criminal justice professionals and individual decision makers should ask include the following. Does the action violate another person's constitutional rights, including the right to due process? Does the action involve treating another person only as a means to an end itself? Is the action illegal? Do you predict that your action will produce more bad than good for all persons affected? And finally, does the action violate department procedure or professional duty? The simplest test is the so-called front page test. This ethical check asks to evaluate our decisions by whether we would be comfortable if it was on the front page of the newspaper. Public disclosure is often a good litmus test for whether something is ethical or not. If confronted with an ethical dilemma, one can follow a series of steps to come to an ethical resolution. Let's take a look. Identify the facts. Identifying all the relevant facts is an essential first step. Sometimes individuals facing a dilemma do not know all the facts, and sometimes the decision to find the facts is an ethical dilemma unto itself. Identify relevant values and concepts. One's values of duty, friendship, loyalty, honesty, and self-preservation are usually at the heart of professional ethical dilemmas. Identify all possible moral dilemmas for each party involved. Recall that this was to help us see when someone's own moral or ethical dilemma is caused by others' actions. Usually, one's ethical dilemma is prefaced on the ethical or unethical decisions. Decide what is the most immediate moral or ethical issue facing the individual. This is always a behavior choice, not an option. Resolve the ethical or moral dilemma by using an ethical system or some other means of decision making. Understanding how ethical decisions are made is critical to law enforcement professionals. Ethical relativism describes the position that what is good or bad changes depending on the individual or group, and that there are no moral absolutes. Relativists believe that what is right is determined by the culture and/or individual belief, and that there are no universal laws. One may look to anthropology and the rise of social science to explain the popularity of moral relativism. Over the course of studying different societies, past and present, primitive and sophisticated, anthropologists have found that there are very few universals across cultures. Basically, cultural relativism defines good as that which contributes to the health and survival of society. Cultural relativists recognize that cultures have very different definitions of right and wrong, and moral relativists argue that there are no fundamental or absolute definitions of right and wrong. Absolutism, as previously discussed, is the position that if something is wrong, it's always wrong. In opposition to cultural relativism, absolutists argue that just because there may be cultural norms endorsing some things, the norms do not make these acts moral, and there are absolute rights and absolute wrongs, whether we agree with them or not. Although cultural relativism holds that different societies may have different moral standards, it also dictates that individuals within a culture conform to the standards of their culture. Therein lies a fundamental flaw with the relativist approach. If there are no universal norms, why should individuals be required to conform to societal or cultural norms? If their actions are not accepted today, it might be argued that they could be accepted tomorrow, if not by their society, perhaps by some other. Relativism allows for different rules and different judgments about what is good. Proponents argue that it promotes tolerance. Universalists argue that if moral absolutes are removed, subjective moral discretion leads to egotistic and nationalistic rationalizations. Universalism is a similar concept in that it's the position that if what is considered wrong is wrong for all people, for all time, and if one wants to perform a certain act, one would have to agree that anyone else should be able to do it as well. Relativism, on the one hand, is criticized because it must allow any practice to be considered good if it's considered good by some people. Therefore, even human sacrifice and cannibalism would be considered to be moral, a thoroughly unpalatable consequence of accepting this doctrine. Absolutism, on the other hand, is also less than satisfactory because we can all think of some examples when the rule must be broken. Situational ethics is the philosophical position that although there are few universal truths, different situations call for different responses. Therefore, some action can be right or wrong depending on situational factors. Moral pluralism is the concept that there are fundamental truths that may dictate different definitions of what is moral in different situations. The solution that will be offered here, whether one calls it situational ethics or some other term, is as follows. There are basic principles of right and wrong. These principles can be applied to ethical dilemmas and issues. These principles may call for different results in different situations, depending on the needs, concerns, relationships, resources, weaknesses, and strengths of the individual actors. Situational ethics is different from relativism because absolute laws are recognized, whereas under relativism, there's no absolute definitions of right and wrong. What are the absolute laws that can be identified as transcendent? Natural law, the golden rule, and the ethics of care could help us fashion a set of moral absolutes that might be general enough to ensure universal agreement. For instance, we could start with the following positions. Treat each person with the utmost respect and care. Do one's duty or duties in such a way that one does not violate the first principle. Interestingly, situational ethics may be entirely consistent with the ethics of care, especially when one contrasts this ethical system with a rule-based absolutist system. In the ethics of care, you will recall, each individual is considered part of the equation of what it is to be good.